God, please, not like this. I'm not ready to die in the dark. The words choked out of Susan Malave, muffled by the grime of the car floor. It was stiflingly hot. A thick, oily heat that turned the shipyard warehouse into a pressurized oven. Susan had just felt the heavy trunk lid of the sedan creak open when she smelled it, gasoline. There it was, the shimmering puddle soaking into the concrete, trailing toward the black garbage bags and rusted crates that would soon be her funeral pyre. For a moment, Susan's heart felt as though it had stopped beating entirely against the cold metal of the trunk. No, 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 she whimpered, her wrists raw and bleeding against the bite of the zip ties. You can't do this. I have names. I have proof. The guard just laughed, the sound hollow against the corrugated steel walls. He flicked a silver lighter, the flame dancing like a demon in the gloom. Boss said no witnesses, sweetheart. Consider this a professional courtesy, you'll be gone before the cops even smell the smoke. Susan lunged forward, trying to roll out of the trunk, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. I have to get out, I have to run. Help, she screamed, the sound lost in the vast, empty rafters. Someone help me. But before the guard could drop the flame, the heavy steel warehouse doors groaned open with a sound like a dying beast. The air in the room suddenly turned sub-zero. The guard froze, the lighter slipping from his trembling fingers. A silhouette stepped into the light, a man whose shadow stretched across the oil-slicked floor like a shroud. The tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light as he looked at the gasoline, then at the girl in the trunk. I don't recall, Richard Harder said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the room, giving an order to burn a woman alive. Dear God, they're going to burn me alive. The trunk was coffin black except for the thin crack of light bleeding through the rusted seam. Susan Malave couldn't feel her hands anymore. The zip ties had cut off circulation 20 minutes ago, maybe longer. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment they'd shoved her into the trunk of the sedan and slammed it shut. She could hear them outside. Boots on concrete. The slosh of liquid. Gasoline. The chemical smell was so thick it burned her nostrils, seeped through the trunk's edges like poison. Douse the whole perimeter, one of them said. Marcus, she thought. The one with the scarred knuckles who'd caught her taking photos at the shipyard. Boss said clean sweep. No evidence, no witnesses. Susan's heart slammed against her ribs. She tried to scream, but the duct tape over her mouth turned it into a muffled whimper. She kicked at the trunk lid. Once. Twice. The metal didn't budge. This can't be how it ends. Not like this. Not for a story. The warehouse doors groaned open. A gust of frigid air swept through, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that Susan felt it even in her metal prison. The voices outside went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that came before violence. I don't recall, a new voice said, low and laced with barely controlled fury, giving an order to burn a woman alive. Even through the trunk, the voice carried weight. Authority. Death. Boss, Mr. Harder, she saw the shipment, she was taking pictures. The gunshot cracked through the air. Susan flinched so hard her head hit the trunk lid. Someone screamed. Not Marcus. Someone else. Then another shot. A body hit the ground with a wet thud. Footsteps approached the car. Slow. Deliberate. The trunk popped open, and Susan squinted against the sudden flood of light. A man's silhouette towered above her, haloed by the warehouse's single overhead bulb. Dark hair slicked back, expensive suit, and neck tattoos that crawled up past his collar like serpents. Richard Harder. The most feared man in the city was staring down at her with eyes that revealed nothing. Out, he said. Susan couldn't move. Her legs were cramped, her wrists bound, her whole body shaking. Richard reached in without hesitation, cut the zip ties with a switchblade in one smooth motion, then peeled the tape from her mouth. She gasped, sucking in air that tasted of gasoline and gunpowder. He pulled her out of the trunk like she weighed nothing, steadied her when her legs buckled. Behind him, 2 bodies lay in spreading pools of blood. A third guard stood frozen by the door, hands raised. "Leave," Richard said without looking at him. "Tell Carlos I'm coming for him." The guard ran. Susan tried to pull away, but Richard's grip on her arm was iron. "Please, I won't write the story, I'll forget everything, just let me." "You're coming with me." His voice allowed no argument. "Those men didn't act alone. Someone in my organization wants you dead, which means someone wants me exposed. Until I know who, you're a liability I can't afford to lose." His dark eyes locked onto hers. "You're safer with me than anywhere else in this city. Trust me on that, Ms. Malave." He guided her toward a black SUV idling outside, its engine a low purr in the night. Susan's mind raced through escape scenarios, but her body betrayed her, exhausted and traumatized. As Richard opened the passenger door, she caught sight of his profile in the dome light. The hard line of his jaw. The tattoos. The man who'd just killed 2 people without blinking. She climbed in because she had no other choice. And as they pulled away from the warehouse, from the bodies and the gasoline and her shattered camera, Susan Malave realized she'd just traded one nightmare for another. The estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, surrounded by walls that looked more like a fortress than a home. Susan watched through the SUV window as iron gates swung open, revealing a sprawling mansion that belonged in architectural magazines, not crime documentaries. Marble columns. Manicured gardens. Fountains that probably cost more than her annual salary. Richard hadn't spoken since they left the warehouse. He'd made 2 phone calls and clipped, cold sentences that told Susan absolutely nothing except that people jumped when he spoke. The SUV stopped at the front entrance. Richard opened her door before she could reach for the handle. Inside. The foyer was all white marble and crystal chandeliers, the kind of beauty that felt sterile. Clinical. A man in a dark suit appeared from nowhere, nodded at Richard, and disappeared just as quickly. Susan's journalist instincts cataloged everything. Security cameras in every corner. Reinforced doors. Windows that were probably bulletproof. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress. "Second floor, 3rd door on the right," Richard said, already walking toward what looked like an office. "You'll find clothes in the closet. Bathrooms en suite. Don't leave the room." Susan grabbed his arm without thinking. He stopped, looked down at her hand on his expensive suit jacket, then at her face. His expression was unreadable. "I need to call my brother," she said. "He'll be worried. He'll call the police if I don't." "No phones," Richard interrupted. "Not until I know who I can trust in my organization. Your brother is safer thinking you're working late than knowing where you actually are." He pulled away and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Susan standing alone in a stranger's mansion with raw wrists and nowhere to go. The room he'd assigned her was bigger than her entire apartment. King bed with silk sheets. Antique furniture. A window that overlooked the gardens and, more importantly, the perimeter wall. Susan waited until the house fell quiet, until she was sure Richard had retreated to wherever crime lords went to brood, then slipped out of the room. The hallway was empty but watched. She could feel the cameras tracking her. She made it to the 1st floor, found a side door near what looked like the kitchen, and stepped outside into the cold night air. Freedom was 300 yards away. Just the gardens and the wall. She ran. She made it 50 feet before floodlights erupted, turning night into day. Before she could change direction, 2 guards materialized from the shadows, not threatening but blocking her path. And then Richard was there, walking toward her with his hands in his pockets like he had all the time in the world. "Going somewhere, Ms. Malave?" Susan's chest heaved. "I'm not your prisoner. You can't just." "You're not my prisoner," Richard agreed, his voice maddeningly calm. "You're my responsibility. There's a difference." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up for her to see. It was a news alert. Her stomach dropped. Journalist Susan Malave wanted for questioning in warehouse arson. 2 bodies found. That was fast, Richard said, pocketing the phone. My guess? Whoever tried to burn you alive just made you the arsonist. And judging by the detective quoted in that article, Detective Ruiz, he's been on Carlos's payroll for years. He stepped closer, and Susan had nowhere to retreat. You walk out those gates, you'll be arrested within the hour. And once you're in a cell, I can't protect you. Carlos will make sure you never make it to trial. Susan's legs felt weak. This is insane. I'm a journalist. I was investigating a story. I have rights. You had rights, Richard corrected. Now you have me. And until I clean house, that's the only thing keeping you alive. He turned and walked back toward the mansion, pausing at the door to look over his shoulder. Coming? Or would you prefer to test your luck with the police? Susan looked at the wall, at the guards, at the floodlights illuminating her like prey. Then she followed the monster back inside. Richard's office was all dark wood and leather, the kind of room where deals were made and lives were ended with equal efficiency. Susan sat in a chair that probably cost more than her car, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Dawn light filtered through the heavy curtains, painting everything in shades of gray. Richard sat across from her, perfectly composed despite the fact that neither of them had slept. His suit jacket was gone, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing more of the intricate tattoos that covered his forearms. He'd been silent for 10 minutes, just watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Why the shipyard? He finally asked. Susan's throat was dry. I got a tip. Anonymous. Said there was trafficking happening out of Container Bay, specifically Dock 7. I thought it was drugs at first, but then you saw the people. It wasn't a question. Susan nodded, her stomach twisting at the memory. The shipping containers with ventilation holes drilled into them. The sounds coming from inside. The way the guards had moved with military precision, checking manifests like they were processing cattle instead of human beings. 23 people, she whispered. I counted. Mostly women. Some teenagers. They were being moved like cargo. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stood, walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. I don't traffic people, Ms. Malave. That's not my business. Never has been. Then why were they using your dock? Your guards? Your shipping manifests with your company's logo on them? He turned, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Susan set down the coffee cup, her hand shaking slightly. I have proof. Photos. Documents. Shipping records that show a pattern going back 6 months. Your operation has been compromised, Mr. Harder. Someone in your organization has been running a side business right under your nose. Show me. I can't. It's all on a backup drive. Hidden. Where? Susan hesitated. This was the only leverage she had, the only thing keeping her valuable enough to keep alive. Safe place. Not here. Not anywhere you can access without me. Richard crossed the room in 3 strides, planted his hands on the arms of her chair, and leaned in close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with gunpowder. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, more terrifying than if he'd shouted. I'm going to explain something to you once. I built my organization on 3 rules: no civilians, no trafficking, and no lies. Someone broke the first 2, and now they've painted a target on both our backs. You think that drive is keeping you safe? It's not. What's keeping you safe is that I need to know who betrayed me before they realize you're still breathing. He pulled back slightly. So I'll ask again. Where is it? Susan's heart hammered, but she held his gaze. My brother. David. He's 16. I sent him a package 3 days ago, told him it was research for a book, told him not to open it, just keep it safe. Her voice cracked. If something happened to me, He was supposed to mail it to the FBI. That's why I need to call him. If he sees that news report, if he thinks I'm dead or on the run, he'll send the drive to the feds," Richard finished. He straightened, ran a hand through his dark hair, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost human. Almost vulnerable. "And the feds will find evidence of human trafficking tied to my operation, which means even if I'm innocent, I go down for it." "You're not innocent," Susan said quietly. "You run an illegal empire. You kill people. You just murdered 2 men in front of me without blinking." "I killed 2 traitors who were about to burn a civilian alive," Richard corrected. "There's a difference. I'm a criminal, Ms. Malave, but I'm not a monster. What I do with rules. With boundaries. The men using my name to traffic people? They're the monsters. And they need to be put down." He pulled out his phone, made a call. "Victor. I need a secure line set up. Untraceable. And I need surveillance on David Malave, 247 Riverside Apartments, Unit 12. Just surveillance. If anyone so much as looks at him wrong, I want to know immediately." Susan's blood ran cold. "If you hurt my brother—" "I'm protecting your brother," Richard interrupted, ending the call. "Because if Carlos or whoever's behind this figures out you're alive, he's the first person they'll use to flush you out." He sat back down, his expression grave. "You're going to call him. Tell him you're safe, that you're working on a big story, and that he needs to hold on to that package no matter what. You're going to sound calm and normal. Can you do that?" Susan swallowed hard. "And if I can't? Then we're both dead, and your brother becomes collateral damage in a war he doesn't even know he's in." The office fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Susan stared at this man, this criminal, this killer, this person who somehow seemed to have more integrity than half the city officials she'd interviewed. He'd saved her life, imprisoned her in a gilded cage, and now he was offering to protect the only family she had left. "There's something else," Susan said quietly. "In those files. I have names. 3 of your top lieutenants. Carlos is one of them, but there are 2 others. And based on the shipping schedules, the money movements, the patterns I tracked," she met his eyes. "This isn't just a side operation. This is a coup. They're building their own empire using your resources, your reputation, and when they have enough power, they're going to take you out." Richard's expression went absolutely still. Not calm. Still. Like a predator that had just spotted its prey. "Names," he said softly. "I need the names." Susan told him. And she watched as Richard Harder transformed from a man into something far more dangerous. Susan couldn't sleep. Her body was exhausted, but her mind kept replaying the warehouse, the trunk, the gasoline smell that still seemed to cling to her skin no matter how many times she'd showered. She stood at the bedroom window in borrowed clothes, silk pajamas that cost more than her monthly rent, staring out at the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. The gardens were beautiful in a cold, manicured way. Hedges cut into geometric perfection. Stone pathways leading to fountains that glittered like diamonds. And beyond it all, the wall that kept the world out and her trapped inside. Movement caught her eye. A figure on the roof of the pool house, barely visible against the night sky. Susan's breath caught. The figure shifted, and moonlight glinted off something metallic. Long, cylindrical. A rifle. Her journalist instincts kicked in before conscious thought. She'd covered enough crime scenes, interviewed enough cops, spent enough time researching for this story to recognize a sniper position when she saw one. And the angle of that rifle was pointed directly at the main house. At Richard's office window, where a light still burned at 2 in the morning. Susan ran. She burst into the hallway, no plan except the certainty that if Richard died, she died. The traitors wouldn't leave witnesses. She sprinted down the corridor, took the stairs 2 at a time, her bare feet silent on the marble. Guards turned as she flew past, shouting, but she didn't stop. Richard's office door was closed. She didn't knock. She slammed it open and screamed, "Get down." Richard looked up from his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder as he processed her panic. But he didn't hesitate. Years of survival instinct made him drop just as the window exploded inward in a shower of glass. The bullet meant for his head buried itself in the leather chair behind where he'd been sitting. Susan hit the floor, covering her head as glass rained down. Richard was already moving, gun drawn from somewhere she hadn't seen, crawling toward the wall and killing the lights with one shot at the switch. The room plunged into darkness broken only by moonlight. "Sniper," Susan gasped. "Pool house roof. I saw him from my window." Richard's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the shattered window. "How many?" "Just one, I think." "But..." Another shot punched through the wall, missing them by inches. Then another. The sniper was repositioning, trying to find them in the dark. Richard grabbed Susan's wrist and pulled her toward the door, keeping low. They made it into the hallway just as his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression went deadly. "Victor's dead." They hit the security room first. He pulled her toward the back of the house, moving with the kind of fluid grace that came from surviving situations like this before. "They're not just here for me. This is a full assault." The sound of gunfire erupted from the front of the house. Shouting. The distinctive crack of automatic weapons. Susan's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Richard led her through a door hidden behind a bookshelf, down a narrow staircase that smelled of concrete and gun oil. A safe room. Or an escape route. Maybe both. "How did they find you?" Susan whispered. "I told you. Someone in my organization is running this coup. They know every property I own, every security protocol, every safe house." He pulled open a weapons locker, tossed her a Kevlar vest. "Put this on." "I don't know how to." "Figure it out. Fast." Susan's hands shook as she strapped on the vest. Richard was already loading magazines, checking weapons with mechanical efficiency. Above them, the gunfire intensified. Someone was screaming. The entire estate had become a war zone. "We can't stay here," Richard said, more to himself than her. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then crushed it under his boot. "They're tracking us. Everything's compromised." He handed Susan a smaller handgun. She stared at it like it was a snake. "I've never." "Safety's off. Point and shoot if anyone who isn't me gets close." "Can you do that?" Susan thought about the warehouse. About Marcus's lighter. About her brother waiting at home, not knowing his sister was caught in a nightmare. She took the gun, her grip tightening around cold metal. "Yes." Richard nodded once, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his face. Then he moved to a panel in the wall, entered a code, and a section swung open revealing a tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "This leads to the old service road, about half a mile from here. There's a vehicle stashed in a barn at the end. We move fast, we move quiet, and we don't stop until we're clear." An explosion rocked the house above them. Dust rained from the ceiling. Someone was using grenades now. They were coming in force, determined to leave no survivors. Richard grabbed a duffel bag from the locker, slung it over his shoulder, and looked at Susan with those dark, unreadable eyes that she was starting to understand meant he was making calculations, running scenarios, deciding who lived and who died. "Stay close to me," he said. "Don't hesitate. Don't second guess. When I tell you to run, you run. When I tell you to shoot, you shoot. Understood?" Susan nodded, her throat too tight for words. They entered the tunnel together, and behind them, Richard sealed the entrance just as footsteps thundered down the stairs. Voices shouted orders. More gunfire. But the sounds grew muffled, distant, as they moved deeper into the darkness. Susan's bare feet hit cold concrete. The gun felt impossibly heavy in her hand. And beside her, Richard Harder moved like a ghost, leading her away from the only fortress he'd ever known and into a night where everyone wanted them dead. "For what it's worth," Richard said quietly as they ran, "you just saved my life." "Don't thank me yet," Susan whispered back, her voice shaking. "We're not out of this." His dark laugh echoed in the tunnel. "No, Ms. Malave. We're definitely not." The safe house had no hot water and only one bed that Richard insisted Susan take while he kept watch. She'd stopped arguing after the first night, too exhausted from running to care about Pride. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the muzzle flash from the sniper rifle, heard the explosion that had consumed Richard's estate, felt the weight of the gun he'd given her. She found him on the porch 2 hours past midnight, sitting on the weathered steps with a bottle of whiskey and a cigarette he wasn't smoking. Just holding it, watching the ember glow and fade in the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Susan asked, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders against the October cold. Richard glanced at her but didn't tell her to go back inside. That felt like progress. "Sleep is a luxury I stopped affording myself years ago." Susan sat beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. The forest around the cabin was silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through pine trees. No city sounds. No sirens. No danger. At least not yet. "Your tattoos," she said quietly. "They're not just decoration, are they?" Richard took a long pull from the bottle, then set it down between them. "No." When he didn't elaborate, Susan pressed gently. "I'm a journalist. Pattern recognition is what I do. The ones on your neck, their names. Maria. Joseph. Elena. Thomas. 6 names total. And the ones on your arms, they look like dates," Richard finished. "The dates they died." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of ghosts. "My family," Richard continued, his voice carefully controlled. "My mother, Maria. My father, Joseph. My sister Elena. Her husband Thomas. Their 2 children, Anna and Miguel. I was 19. Away at college, studying business like my father wanted. Trying to be legitimate. Trying to be good." His jaw tightened. "While I was taking exams, Carlos and his crew were burning down my family's restaurant. My father refused to pay protection money. Said he'd built his business honestly and wouldn't bow to criminals." Susan's chest tightened. "The fire. I remember reading about it. The news said it was an electrical fault. The news said what the police were paid to say." Richard's voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands were clenched into fists. "They burned them alive. All 6 of them. Locked the doors from the outside and set it ablaze. My sister tried to get the children out through a window. The coroner said she almost made it." "Richard, Don't." He cut her off. "I don't want sympathy. I stopped wanting that the day I buried them." He finally lit the cigarette, took a drag, exhaled smoke into the night. "I spent 5 years building what I have. Learning the game. Becoming someone Carlos couldn't touch. Someone no one could touch. I built my empire on one promise: no civilians. No innocents. No one who isn't playing the game gets hurt." His dark eyes met hers. "That's why I killed those men in the warehouse. They broke my only rule. The rule that separates me from the animals who murdered my family." Susan understood now. The code. The fury when he'd found her about to be burned alive. The absolute conviction in his voice when he'd said he didn't traffic people. Richard Harder wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man who'd spent 15 years building a fortress around a wound that had never healed. "Carlos did this," Susan said softly. "He killed them. Carlos held the match. Others poured the gasoline. But yes, Carlos has been at the center of this from the beginning. And now he's using my name, my organization, to traffic people. To do the exact thing I swore would never happen under my watch." Richard's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He took everything from me once. I won't let him do it again. Susan reached out slowly, covering his clenched fist with her hand. He stiffened but didn't pull away. Then we stop him, she said. Together. Richard looked at her hand on his, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly. But something close. Recognition. Understanding. The acknowledgement that they were both people who'd lost too much and refused to lose anything else. You should get some sleep, he said finally. We have a war to prepare for. But neither of them moved. They sat together on the porch of a safe house in the middle of nowhere, two people running from death, surrounded by ghosts, and for the first time since the warehouse, Susan felt like she understood the man beside her. Not a monster. Not a hero. Just a man trying to keep the promise he'd made to the dead. The burner phone rang at 3 a.m. Susan jolted awake from the couch in the safe house, a cramped two-room cabin 50 miles outside the city that smelled of mildew and old wood. Richard was already awake, sitting at the small table with a laptop and maps spread out, planning his counterattack against the men who'd burned down his empire. He looked at the phone, then at Susan. No one has this number except my most trusted people. Susan's stomach dropped. She reached for the phone with shaking hands. Hello? Susan. The voice was smooth, cultured, almost friendly. Carlos. I hope I'm not calling too late. Her blood turned to ice. How did you get this number? The same way I got into your apartment. The same way I found your brother. A pause, deliberate and cruel. Would you like to speak to him? The phone rustled. Then David's voice, young and terrified. Susan? Susan, please, I don't know what they want, they just. The sound of a slap. David's cry cut short. Stop. Susan screamed, lurching to her feet. Richard was beside her instantly, his hand on her shoulder, his face carved from stone. Don't hurt him. Please. He's just a kid, he doesn't know anything. He knows enough, Carlos interrupted smoothly. He has a package. A backup drive with some very interesting information. Information that could destroy what's left of Richard's organization and implicate him in crimes he didn't commit. You're very thorough, Ms. Malave. I appreciate that in a journalist. Susan's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone. Richard took it from her, switched it to speaker, his expression deadly calm. Carlos, he said quietly. Richard. Still alive. How disappointing. Carlos's voice dripped with mock concern. I have to admit, you're more resilient than I anticipated. But then again, you always were too stubborn to die properly. What do you want? What I've always wanted. Your empire. Your territory. Your legacy. Everything you built, I'm going to take, and I'm going to do it better. Cleaner. More profitable. The smile in his voice was audible. But first, I need to tie up some loose ends. The journalist and her evidence. You and your outdated moral code. The boy is just leverage. Richard's jaw tightened. Name your terms. The drive. Delivered personally by Susan. And you, Richard. Unarmed. Alone. Both of you walk into Dock 7 tomorrow at midnight. You give me what I want, and the boy goes free. You try anything clever, and I mail him back to his sister in pieces. Susan's knees buckled. Richard caught her, kept her upright with one arm while holding the phone with the other. How do I know he's alive? Richard demanded. Another rustle. David's voice again, broken and pleading. Susan, don't come. Don't do what they. The sound of metal striking flesh. Silence. He's alive, Carlos said. For now. Midnight tomorrow. Dock 7. The same place where this all started. Poetic, don't you think? A pause. Oh, and Richard? Bring backup, use any of your old resources, contact any authorities, and the boy dies. You have no allies left. No army. No fortress. You're just a man now. A man about to lose everything. The line went dead. Susan collapsed onto the couch, her whole body shaking. Richard stood frozen, the phone still in his hand, staring at nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He's going to kill all three of us. Even if we give him everything. I know. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But David is 16 years old. He's all I have left. I don't care if it's a trap. I don't care if we die. I'm going. Richard looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something human in those dark eyes. Not kindness. Something harder. Respect. Then we go together, he said. And we make sure Carlos regrets ever touching your brother. Richard laid out the weapons on the cabin's rickety table like a surgeon preparing for an operation. 2 handguns. A tactical knife. Extra magazines. A Kevlar vest that had seen better days. He moved with mechanical precision, checking each piece of equipment with the kind of focus that came from knowing he probably wouldn't survive the night. Susan watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her jaw set. You're planning to go alone? Yes. Richard didn't look up, didn't break his rhythm. He was loading bullets into a magazine with steady hands. That's suicide. That's the point. He finally met her eyes. Carlos wants me dead. He gets what he wants. You walk in, hand over the drive, collect your brother, and walk out. I'll make sure you have enough time. By dying. By being the distraction. Richard's voice was maddeningly calm. He'll focus on me. Savor it. Give you the window you need to get David out. Susan crossed the room in 3 strides and slammed her hand down on the table, scattering bullets across the scarred wood. That's the stupidest plan I've ever heard, and I once watched a city councilman try to explain embezzlement on live television. Richard's expression hardened. This isn't a negotiation. You're right. It's not. Susan pulled out the crumpled blueprints she'd stolen from the shipyard 3 weeks ago, back when this was just a story and not her entire life. She spread them across the table, pointing to the layout. Dock 7 has 3 entry points. Main entrance here, which is where Carlos will expect us. Service entrance on the east side, probably guarded but manageable. And this, she tapped a small marking, maintenance tunnel that runs under the dock from the adjacent warehouse. Built in the 70s, supposedly sealed, but I checked it 2 weeks ago. It's still accessible. Richard studied the blueprints, his expression unreadable. You went into that tunnel? I'm thorough. Susan traced the path with her finger. It comes up inside the main warehouse floor, behind these storage containers. If we come in through there, we can position ourselves with cover before Carlos even knows we've arrived. We get David first, then we control the situation. And when Carlos figures out we're not playing by his rules, then we improvise. Susan met his dark eyes without flinching. But we do it together. You don't get to martyr yourself for my brother. That's not how this works. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. You could die. I could die walking in the front door while you throw yourself on a grenade too. At least this way we have a chance. She straightened, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. I know that shipyard better than anyone. I spent 3 weeks mapping every container, every guard rotation, every blind spot. You need me, Richard. Admit it. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You're insane. I'm a journalist. Same thing. Susan pulled out the backup drive from her pocket, held it up. This is leverage. Information is power. We don't just hand it over. We use it. Make them think we're cooperating while we maneuver into position. Richard took the drive, turned it over in his hands. If this goes wrong. It won't. If it does, he continued, his voice dropping, you take David and you run. You don't look back. You don't try to save me. You disappear and you never stop running. Understood? Susan's throat tightened. That's not going to happen. Promise me, Susan. Richard stepped closer, and the intensity in his eyes was almost overwhelming. Promise me that if it comes down to you or me, you choose yourself. Choose your brother. Choose living. She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him that she didn't make promises she couldn't keep. But the look on his face, the weight of 15 years of grief and guilt and rage, made her pause. Only if you promise me the same thing, she said quietly. No suicide missions. No martyrdom. We both walk out, or neither of us does. Richard held her gaze for a long moment, then extended his hand. Deal. Susan shook it, his grip firm and warm and alive. They spent the next 6 hours preparing. Memorizing the layout. Planning contingencies. Loading weapons neither of them wanted to use. And when midnight approached, they drove toward the shipyard in stolen silence, two people walking into hell with nothing but each other and a promise they both knew they might not be able to keep. The maintenance tunnel smelled exactly like Susan remembered. Rust and stagnant water and decades of industrial decay. She moved through the darkness with Richard behind her, their footsteps silent on the slick concrete. The weight of the gun in her hand felt less foreign now. More like a promise she intended to keep. They emerged behind a wall of shipping containers, exactly where the blueprints had indicated. Through the gaps in the metal, Susan could see the main warehouse floor lit by harsh industrial lights. Carlos stood in the center like a king holding court, flanked by 6 armed men. And there, zip-tied to a chair with blood running from his nose, was David. Susan's breath caught. Richard's hand found her shoulder, squeezed once. Steady. We stick to the plan, he whispered. Get David clear first. Carlos checked his watch, his voice carrying across the warehouse. 5 minutes late, Richard. That's not like you. You're usually so punctual about your own execution. I'm here. Richard stepped out from behind the containers, hands raised, the backup drive held up in one hand. Susan stayed hidden, her heart hammering as she watched her brother's head snap up, hope and terror warring on his bruised face. And the journalist? Carlos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Right here, Susan called out, stepping into view with the gun leveled at Carlos's head. 3 of his men immediately raised their weapons. Stalemate. Carlos laughed, genuinely amused. You brought the civilian to a gunfight. How romantic. Let the boy go, Richard said, his voice deadly calm. You get the drive. You get me. That was the deal. The deal, Carlos repeated, pulling his own weapon and pressing it against David's temple, was that you'd come unarmed and alone. You've already broken the terms, so why should I honor mine? Everything happened at once. Richard threw the drive, not at Carlos, but at the nearest guard, a distraction that bought Susan 1 second. She fired, her first shot going wide but the second catching the guard in the shoulder. Richard was already moving, a blade appearing in his hand from somewhere, burying it in another guard's throat before the man could even raise his rifle. David threw himself sideways, chair and all, as Carlos's shot went high. Susan ran toward her brother, firing twice more to keep heads down. Bullets punched into containers around her. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Richard fought like something feral, using the containers for cover, taking down Carlos's men with brutal efficiency. A guard came around Susan's left side. She turned and pulled the trigger, watched him drop, felt nothing but the fierce need to reach David. She made it to him, cut the zip ties with shaking hands. Can you run? Yes. David's voice cracked. Susan, behind you. She spun. Carlos had his gun trained on them, his expression twisted with rage. You stupid girl. You should have stayed a journalist. The shot never came. Richard tackled Carlos from the side, both men crashing into a stack of crates. They fought viciously, no technique, just rage and survival. Carlos got his hands around Richard's throat, squeezing, and Susan raised her gun but couldn't get a clear shot. David grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it with everything he had. It connected with Carlos's skull with a sickening crack. The older man's grip loosened. Richard shoved him off, gasping for air. Carlos tried to crawl away, blood streaming from his head. Richard picked up the fallen gun, stood over him, and for a moment Susan thought he would pull the trigger. End it. Finish what had started 15 years ago in a burning restaurant. But Richard lowered the weapon. You don't get the mercy of a quick death, he said quietly. You get to rot in a federal prison for trafficking. For murder. For every life you destroyed. He looked at Susan. You still have those files? She nodded, pulling out her phone. Already sent to the FBI. Every name. Every transaction. Every piece of evidence. Carlos's laugh was wet, pained. You think the feds will touch me? I own half the department. Not anymore. Richard's smile was cold. You're yesterday's king. And your empire just fell. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Susan grabbed David, held him tight as he shook against her. Richard stood over Carlos, a dark silhouette against the warehouse lights, victorious and hollow all at once. The war was over. But the cost of victory was written in blood across the concrete floor, in the bodies of men who'd betrayed everything, and in the eyes of a man who'd finally avenged his family but found no peace in it. Susan took Richard's hand as the red and blue lights flooded through the warehouse doors. They'd survived. Together. The maintenance tunnel smelled exactly like Susan remembered. Rust and stagnant water and decades of industrial decay. She moved through the darkness with Richard behind her, their footsteps silent on the slick concrete. The weight of the gun in her hand felt less foreign now. More like a promise she intended to keep. They emerged behind a wall of shipping containers, exactly where the blueprints had indicated. Through the gaps in the metal, Susan could see the main warehouse floor lit by harsh industrial lights. Carlos stood in the center like a king holding court, flanked by 6 armed men. And there, zip-tied to a chair with blood running from his nose, was David. Susan's breath caught. Richard's hand found her shoulder, squeezed once. Steady. We stick to the plan, he whispered. Get David clear first. Carlos checked his watch, his voice carrying across the warehouse. 5 minutes late, Richard. That's not like you. You're usually so punctual about your own execution. I'm here. Richard stepped out from behind the containers, hands raised, the backup drive held up in one hand. Susan stayed hidden, her heart hammering as she watched her brother's head snap up, hope and terror warring on his bruised face. And the journalist? Carlos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Right here, Susan called out, stepping into view with the gun leveled at Carlos's head. 3 of his men immediately raised their weapons. Stalemate. Carlos laughed, genuinely amused. You brought the civilian to a gunfight. How romantic. Let the boy go, Richard said, his voice deadly calm. You get the drive. You get me. That was the deal. The deal, Carlos repeated, pulling his own weapon and pressing it against David's temple, was that you'd come unarmed and alone. You've already broken the terms, so why should I honor mine? Everything happened at once. Richard threw the drive, not at Carlos, but at the nearest guard, a distraction that bought Susan 1 second. She fired, her first shot going wide but the second catching the guard in the shoulder. Richard was already moving, a blade appearing in his hand from somewhere, burying it in another guard's throat before the man could even raise his rifle. David threw himself sideways, chair and all, as Carlos's shot went high. Susan ran toward her brother, firing twice more to keep heads down. Bullets punched into containers around her. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Richard fought like something feral, using the containers for cover, taking down Carlos's men with brutal efficiency. A guard came around Susan's left side. She turned and pulled the trigger, watched him drop, felt nothing but the fierce need to reach David. She made it to him, cut the zip ties with shaking hands. "Can you run?" "Yes." David's voice cracked. "Susan, behind you." She spun. Carlos had his gun trained on them, his expression twisted with rage. "You stupid girl. You should have stayed a journalist." The shot never came. Richard tackled Carlos from the side, both men crashing into a stack of crates. They fought viciously, no technique, just rage and survival. Carlos got his hands around Richard's throat, squeezing, and Susan raised her gun but couldn't get a clear shot. David grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it with everything he had. It connected with Carlos's skull with a sickening crack. The older man's grip loosened. Richard shoved him off, gasping for air. Carlos tried to crawl away, blood streaming from his head. Richard picked up the fallen gun, stood over him, and for a moment Susan thought he would pull the trigger. End it. Finish what had started 15 years ago in a burning restaurant. But Richard lowered the weapon. "You don't get the mercy of a quick death," he said quietly. "You get to rot in a federal prison for trafficking. For murder. For every life you destroyed." He looked at Susan. "You still have those files?" She nodded, pulling out her phone. "Already sent to the FBI. Every name. Every transaction. Every piece of evidence." Carlos's laugh was wet, pained. "You think the feds will touch me? I own half the department." "Not anymore." Richard's smile was cold. "You're yesterday's king. And your empire just fell." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Susan grabbed David, held him tight as he shook against her. Richard stood over Carlos, a dark silhouette against the warehouse lights, victorious and hollow all at once. The war was over. But the cost of victory was written in blood across the concrete floor, in the bodies of men who'd betrayed everything, and in the eyes of a man who'd finally avenged his family but found no peace in it. Susan took Richard's hand as the red and blue lights flooded through the warehouse doors. They'd survived. Together.